Here is the thing that I keep returning to. Not the grand architecture, not the lost empires, not the mud flood theories that flood every comment section whenever someone points a camera at a half-buried building. Just this. Pipe, cast iron, ceramic, occasionally lead, running water, pressure systems, drains, infrastructure, the kind of thing you cannot accidentally build, because infrastructure is not decorative. A cathedral can be built by hands that don't fully understand cathedrals. You follow the plan, you cut the stone, you raise the arch. But a pressurized water system requires engineering literacy. It requires someone who understands gradient, flow rate, material resistance, and the behavior of water under force. You cannot inherit a working pipe network the way you inherit a building. And yet, across what historians formally call the 18th and 19th centuries, the period when indoor plumbing was supposedly being invented, tested, argued over, and only gradually installed into buildings. There are structures all over the former breadth of what some researchers call the Tartarian sphere that show pipe channels, drainage systems, and pressure-fed water features that predate the official installation record, sometimes by decades, sometimes by more. I want to be careful here because careful is the only thing worth being. I am not saying this proves a lost civilization. I am not saying it proves anything at all, yet. What I am saying is that when you start mapping the dates, when something was built, when it was occupied, when plumbing was officially available in that region, and when the plumbing in that structure actually appears, the numbers do not always line up in the direction the official record implies they should. Let me tell you what the mainstream account says, because it deserves to be heard first. The history of modern indoor plumbing, as most of us were taught it, is a story of slow, incremental progress. The Romans had aqueducts, yes, but that knowledge collapsed with the empire. The medieval period was largely without running water. The real development of indoor plumbing began in the early 19th century, accelerated after the cholera outbreaks proved the link between contaminated water and disease, and became standard in wealthy urban buildings by roughly the 1870s and 1880s. It is a clean narrative. It has a cause, epidemic fear. It has heroes, engineers, reformers, public health advocates. It has a timeline that moves in one direction. And honestly, for most buildings in most cities, it fits. You can walk into any Victorian archive and find the waterboard records, the contracts, the dates of connection. The paper trail is there. I am not disputing any of that. What I am asking is whether that paper trail tells the whole story, or only the story that was created when someone came along and documented what already existed. Here is the first crack. There is a category of large institutional buildings across Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Russian interior, buildings that served administrative, academic, or civic functions that contain, within their original construction fabric, not retrofitted pipe chases, but purpose-built channels, clearly designed for water flow, not decorative channels, not drainage gutters for rainwater, internal pressurized pipe systems embedded in walls and floors at the time of original construction, in buildings that official records date to periods when that technology was not yet available in those regions. And I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is easy to brush past it. The instinct is to say, the records are wrong, the building was renovated, the channels served some other purpose we are not recognizing. All of those are reasonable responses. All of them deserve to be taken seriously. But let me tell you what makes each of them harder than it first appears. The claim that records are wrong is plausible for any single building. Records are lost, misdated, misattributed all the time. But when you have not one building but dozens, spread across thousands of kilometers and multiple independent archival systems, Russian Imperial records, Ottoman administrative records, Austro-Hungarian municipal records, Central Asian Khanate documentation, the probability that they all independently contain the same error, in the same direction, by the same magnitude, starts to ask something of you. The claim that buildings were renovated is also reasonable, and in many cases true. Renovation is real. Upgrades happen. But a renovation leaves traces. Different mortar generations, interruption patterns in masonry, the physical scar of a new pipe forced through old stone versus a channel that was always there. Structural historians can usually tell, and in a significant number of these buildings, they cannot find the renovation scar. The pipes appear to be original, which means either the dating of the building is wrong, or the dating of the technology is wrong. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable, because neither of those options is comfortable. If the buildings are younger than their official dates, you need to explain why records across multiple independent systems all agree on an older date. If the technology is older than the official record, you need to explain why that technology appears, is used, and then disappears from the documentary record as if it were never there, only to be reinvented decades later by the people who inherited the buildings that already contained it. The second option is the one I cannot stop thinking about. Not because it is more dramatic, it is actually the quieter of the two, but because it has a structural parallel that keeps surfacing when I look at related anomalies. The parallel is this: we have other documented cases in history where a technology was present in physical artifacts long before it appeared in the written record, not because the technology was suppressed necessarily, but because documentation systems and physical reality operate on different timescales, serve different interests, and sometimes simply do not overlap. But here is what makes the water infrastructure case different from most of those parallels. In most cases of underdocumented technology, the technology appears in isolated, peripheral examples, one unusual artifact here, one anomalous site there. What I am describing is not isolated. It appears in civic infrastructure, in buildings designed to serve populations, in structures that imply not only the knowledge of pressurized water systems, but the organized labor, supply chains, and maintenance cultures required to build them at scale and keep them running. That is not an anomaly. That is a system, and a system is something different. A system requires consensus. It requires that multiple people, engineers, architects, administrators, laborers, all share the same body of technical knowledge, all apply it in the same way, all make the same assumptions about how water should move through a building. You cannot accidentally produce a consistent system. You can accidentally produce a single remarkable artifact. You cannot accidentally produce a network of buildings across a continent that all solve the same hydraulic problems in the same way, using the same design logic, and then leave no unified documentation of that shared logic. I want to stop here and address what is probably the most compelling counter-argument, because it is one I took seriously for a long time. The counter-argument is this: the Tartaria framework itself is historically suspect. Tartaria, as a defined political entity, is a somewhat nebulous category. It appears on European maps as a vast, poorly understood geographic zone rather than a unified civilization. And the people who have most enthusiastically revived the Tartaria concept in recent years have often done so in service of claims that range from speculative to demonstrably false. I accept that. I take it seriously. I am not using Tartaria as a synonym for a lost super-civilization with advanced technology and secret knowledge. I am using it the way early modern European cartographers used it, as a geographic and administrative shorthand for a region. The region is real. The buildings in that region are real. The pipe systems in those buildings are real. The question of when those systems were installed, and by whom, is a legitimate historical question, regardless of what label you attach to the geography. The question is not mystical. It does not require ancient aliens or suppressed empires or a global conspiracy of silence. What it requires is something much simpler and, I think, much more disturbing. The possibility that the official timeline of a specific technology in a specific region was written after the fact by people who were documenting inheritance rather than invention, and that the act of documentation created the impression of invention where actually there had only been continuity. Let me show you what I mean by expansion. The same pattern I am describing in the Russian Imperial sphere appears independently in structures documented in the Ottoman administrative records during the same general period. Large civic buildings, hospitals, administrative complexes, educational institutions that contain hydraulic features inconsistent with their official construction dates. Not every building, not most buildings, but enough buildings, appearing consistently enough across enough independent archival sources that the pattern cannot be attributed to a single archive's errors. It also appears in the Qing administrative territories of Central Asia, in a smaller number of cases, but with the same structural feature. The pipe infrastructure appears to be coeval with the original building fabric, and the official technological introduction date for the region does not account for it. 3 independent administrative systems, covering enormous and largely non-overlapping geographic areas, each producing the same anomaly in their institutional architecture. That is the thing that keeps me up at night, if I am honest. Because here is the coordination problem. If you wanted to falsify this pattern, if you wanted to insert the appearance of early plumbing into buildings that did not originally have it, you would need extraordinary coordination across systems that were not, in most cases, friendly to each other. The Russian Imperial administration and the Ottoman administration were frequently at war. The Qing administration and the Russian Imperial administration were competitors for Central Asian territory. There is no obvious mechanism by which these 3 independent bureaucracies, with different languages, different recording systems, and active geopolitical rivalries, would have simultaneously agreed to falsify infrastructure records in the same direction. Suppression conspiracies require a suppressor. They require someone at the center, coordinating the silence, deciding what gets hidden and what gets shown. And I am not proposing that. I am proposing something more structurally honest, that when multiple institutions independently inherit infrastructure they did not build, and independently document that inheritance as if it were construction, they do not need to coordinate. They each do the same thing, rationalize what is already there, write the records to match the world they found, and produce collectively and without communication a uniform false impression. The silence organizes itself, not through malice, not through conspiracy, through the much more ordinary human tendency to document what we understand and to quietly recategorize what we don't. An administrator who inherits a building with working pipes and no construction records does not write pipes of unknown origin, predating known technology. He writes building recently upgraded with modern amenities. He writes the world into a shape that makes sense to him. And 100 years later, you have an archive full of confident documentation that points in one direction and a set of physical buildings that quietly point in another. Here is another place I have to pause and be honest with myself, because intellectual honesty requires it. Is it possible that I am pattern matching too aggressively? Is it possible that the buildings I am describing have explanations I have not encountered, that the pipe channels served functions other than pressurized water, that regional craft traditions included hydraulic features we do not currently associate with those periods, that the dating methods used to establish construction timelines have known error ranges that could account for the discrepancies? Yes to all of it. All of those are live possibilities. But here is what I have found when I pursue each of them. The alternative function argument, that the channels served drainage or structural roles, fails in a specific subset of cases where the channel geometry is inconsistent with gravity drainage and only makes sense under positive pressure. You can tell the difference. Gravity drainage runs downhill. Pressurized supply does not have to. When you find horizontal channels at elevation, terminating in what appear to be fixture connection points, the drainage explanation requires more special pleading than the supply explanation. The regional craft tradition argument is interesting, and I take it more seriously. It is genuinely possible that certain building traditions in certain regions incorporated hydraulic features that were locally common but did not enter the pan-European technical literature that forms the backbone of the official history. Regional knowledge is always underdocumented relative to metropolitan knowledge. This is a real phenomenon, but a regional craft tradition produces regional consistency, not cross-continental consistency. The fact that the same features appear in buildings across systems that demonstrably did not share craft traditions is the problem that this argument does not solve. And the dating error argument is the one that feels most reasonable on the surface and the most difficult to apply consistently when you look closely. Dating error tends to be random. Some buildings date too early, some too late, and the errors distribute in both directions. What I am describing is directional error. In every case, the official date places the technology later than the physical evidence suggests. Systematic directional error is not what random dating error looks like. Systematic directional error looks like someone consistently making the same interpretive choice over and over for reasons that may not have been conscious. And so I come back to the question that started all of this, but now it sits differently than it did at the beginning. It is no longer just about pipe, it is about something the pipe is pointing toward, a gap between the timeline of documented knowledge and the timeline of applied knowledge, a gap that, if real, implies not a conspiracy, but a discontinuity, a break in the chain of institutional memory, so significant that the people who inherited what came before genuinely did not know they had inherited it, and documented their ignorance as if it were the whole story. What would that discontinuity look like from the inside? How would it feel to administer a building whose technical systems you could not replicate, whose construction logic you could not read, whose infrastructure worked in ways your own engineering literature did not explain? Would you investigate it, or would you simply use it, and when the time came to document it, write it into the framework that made the most sense to your contemporary understanding? I think most of us in that position would do the latter, not from dishonesty, from the entirely human need to make the world legible. The buildings are still there. Some of them, some have been demolished, some renovated beyond recognition, some absorbed into later construction, in ways that make the original fabric impossible to isolate. But enough remain, and in enough of those that remain, if you look at the walls, at the floor channels, at the points where pipes enter and exit structural elements, at the material analysis of the pipe compound relative to the material analysis of the surrounding masonry, the story the building tells and the story the record tells are not the same story. I am not going to tell you what that means. I don't think I know. What I think I know is that there is a question here that the official record has not seriously engaged with, not because the question is embarrassing or threatening or ideologically dangerous, but simply because the gap between physical evidence and documentary evidence is one that most historians are not trained to interrogate in this particular way. Physical historians and documentary historians tend to move in parallel, and the anomalies that live in the space between their methodologies tend to go unaddressed by both. And maybe that is the answer. Maybe the entire thing resolves into disciplinary gaps and archival limitations and dating error and regional craft traditions and renovation scars that someone more qualified than me would find immediately. Maybe I hold that possibility with genuine seriousness, but I also hold the other possibility that somewhere between the pipe in the wall and the date in the record, there is a distance that nobody has yet bothered to measure, and I keep wondering what you would find if you did.